Hello, YouTube subscribers, and those of you that are here for the controversy. Let's admit it, controversial videos get lots of hits, and some of you are here just for that. Well, I hope you listen long enough to see what I have to say because I think this video is much more than just about one man. I honestly didn't think I would do another video like this. I did the one on Dwight Dress, trying to just hoping to wake some people up so they would listen a little more critically to him. I mean, he was basically praising Islam and the Quran in his series of 3 sermons. And look, the Quran was written by a pedophile. God and Satan do not work together. End of story. So if I woke a few people up so they listen a little more critically, great. But other than that, I consider that a lame video, and I wanted to do a whole lot more. So today, yeah, I'm going to talk about Marvin Moore and some comments he made. And if you're somebody that likes Marvin Moore, you follow Marvin Moore, I ask you just listen at least to 9 or 10 minutes of this video. Look at some of the statements he has made, and then you decide whether you want to keep listening to this man or not. Well, who is Marvin Moore? Well, we know he has been the editor of Signs of the Times for many, many years. He worked at Pacific Press for many, many, many years. He's still a speaker that is invited to camp meetings and churches, and he has not published, he's written many books that have been promoted and sold at the ABC. The first quote of his I want to start with, I think, is just, it really shows you where he's coming from. And this is something he wrote all the way back in 1999 in Signs of the Times, and it was an article titled, What is Faith? In this article, he made this statement. The condition of salvation is not victory over sin, it's not obedience, it's not keeping God's laws. Now, I know that many, maybe even most of you, would probably agree with that statement. Because what I have found in the church today is that even conservative, very conservative people, when I ask them, is obedience a condition to salvation? They'll say no, or they'll him and haw around, not wanting to answer it, or they'll say, well, you know, obedience is a fruit of salvation, but it's not a, wouldn't say a condition. Anyway, people do not want to say obedience is a condition of salvation. So I read a statement here, Marvin Moore, he says, victory over sin, obedience is not a condition of salvation. Many people can agree with that statement. But I bet those of you that do agree with it have never read this statement from Signs of the Times, which was written 100 years earlier in 1899. Implicit obedience is the condition of salvation. God's law must be obeyed in every particular. Now we have a very different, apparently very different theology here. One says obedience is a condition of salvation. The other says obedience is not the condition of salvation. And when I say this video is much more than just about Marvin Moore, I really mean it. What I hope to do in this video is show you the difference between the church today and how it was 100 years ago. And I hope that some of you will wake up and realize just how widespread new theology really has gotten in the church when you see some of the statements that I'll show you today. There is no way to harmonize these two statements. The one from Ellen White in 1899 and the one from Marvin Moore 1999. There is nothing taken out of context. As a matter of fact, I hope you do go look the one up by Ellen White and read the whole thing there, because she goes on for 2 or 3 more paragraphs talking about how you have to obey. And Marvin Moore has certainly gone on record many more times since 1999 reaffirming what he has stated there. Someone even challenged him on that statement. He came back a couple years later and said, "No, you're a legalist." He said, "Obedience is not a condition to salvation." So, for those of you that have followed Marvin Moore or always believed that way, I don't know what could be going through your mind right now other than you will just tune it out and go about your life the way you've always done, or you're thinking maybe somehow I've twisted something around. But there's no twisting here, there's no way to twist it. These are two very, very different religions, we could say. One says you're just saved and it's not obedience and the law has nothing to do with it. The other says obedience is the condition to salvation. Now, I keep repeating that because I'm trying to really make this clear that this is the difference between the church of 100 years ago and the church today. It is amazing to me that Adventists have gotten to the position, to the state they are in today, where there are so many Adventists now teaching that we can't obey, that it's not about obedience. They want to talk about this relationship thing. It's a relationship. They want to redefine sin as a broken relationship. Even Marvin Moore does that in a book, his book, Gospel versus Legalism. He states this on page 140. At the bottom of this misunderstanding of the gospel, what he means there is people like me that say you have to obey. He says, I'm a legalist and I'm misunderstanding the gospel. He says at the bottom of that misunderstanding is an incorrect definition of sin. The idea that sin is what we do, meaning breaking the law, rather than what we are, meaning broken relationship. So you see, he's coming from the same new theology background, this redefinition of sin. And if you watch my other videos, you know I've told you that when you redefine sin, you redefine your whole belief system. And this is exactly what they've done in Adventism to where 100 years, well, a little more than 100 years now, but you know what I'm saying, 100 years later is unrecognizable. The pioneers today would not recognize the church. As a matter of fact, George Knight, another new theology proponent, even stated that in a book. He said, many of the pioneers today would not be able to be baptized into the church because they would not agree with the 28 fundamental beliefs. You see, the new theology people realize and understand even the fundamental beliefs have been twisted to the point where the liberals can accept them. For those of you that are conservative and you think the fundamental beliefs teaches the truth, you need to read them with a very critical eye and compare them and contrast them to Bible readings from the home 1888 version, not the modern version. And yes, they have been changed because I have both. I have an original 1888 version of Bible reading for the homes. The church has changed drastically, people. It changed from teaching obedience is a condition to salvation to where now they say obedience is not a condition to salvation. It is night and day, and exactly what Ellen White said would happen. She said that in the last days, instead of being legalists like the Jews, people would be all about love, love, and grace, grace, and obedience would be nothing. And when she wrote that, she wasn't writing it for the Sunday churches. So I go back to my original thought here about how is it that Adventists have reached this state where in 1844, the whole movement in 1844 was about judgment was starting. The sanctuary was being cleansed. So a church was being raised up to teach people, get ready, get ready, get ready. You have to actually keep the law of God. How as we got from there to we're saved, we're saved, we're saved. It's just a relationship, even if I'm willfully breaking the law of God. Well, these men that make these statements don't believe like you. If you really look at some of the things they're saying, you'll question the rest of what they have to say. I really think sometimes people will read their books and skip over a whole lot of stuff because some of the stuff in this book, Gospel versus Legalism, I want to look at a couple other quotes of it from Marvin Moore, are just absolutely astounding. And I say, how is it that any man that writes the things he's written in his book can still have any position in the Seventh Day Adventist Church? And here's one of the statements he wrote. It's page 80 of this book. Now, for those of you to follow him, you tell me, do you believe what he's going to say here or what he states here? He stated on page 80, in its time, the law that God revealed at Sinai was the best he had to offer. Do you believe the Ten Commandments was just the best God had to offer back then? He has something better now? That's what he's saying here. He goes on. Here's something else I want you to notice about both Sinai and Calvary. Each was the beginning of a new religion. Sinai began the Israelite religion, Calvary began the Christian religion, and each was God's true religion for its time. Notice also that each of these religions replaced the system that preceded it, and each was a great improvement over the preceding system. Now, when you read that, do you really hear what he's saying, or do you skim over it because you just trust in man? Look at what he's actually saying. The law was just the best he had for Sinai, but we're with Calvary, which is the beginning of a new religion. He didn't tie these two together accidentally. Calvary's a new religion. The law was the best they had back then, but we have something better. So, in other words, we don't have the law today. Yes, that is what he is teaching here. And if you don't want to accept that's what he's actually teaching, let me use another statement out of this book. Now, this one is just so obvious. I don't know anyone, any true 70 Adventist that can read this and still think this man is a real 7-day Adventist. Page 122, 123, he stated, we need to consider the possibility that the Sabbath of the commandments might be included in Paul's comments in Galatians 4:10 about days, months, seasons, and years. Now, maybe people read that and we're such poor Bible students today, we don't know what he's saying there. But for those of you who don't understand what he's saying and you don't recall what Galatians 4:10 is about, let's read that very quickly. Galatians 4:9-10. But now, after that you have known God, or rather have known a God, how turn you again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto you desire again to be in bondage? You observe days and months and times and years. And we should include the Sabbath commandment there as a weak and beggarly element that keeps us under bondage. That's what he said. I am not making this up. There is no twisting anything out of context here. If you're going to say we should consider whether a Sabbath should be included in there, what you're saying is we should consider whether or not we should really honor the Sabbath. And this is the man in charge of the outreach magazine of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, will you please explain to me again how this happens? How is it someone like this can be in charge of the outreach magazine of the Seventh-day Adventist Church? Any honest Bible student knows that he's not talking about commandments in this passage. Only the very radical ecumenicals will throw the law in there and say the law is completely done away with. You live like you want as long as you believe you're saved. Here is Marvin Moore saying we should consider the Sabbath of the commandments being included in Paul's comments in Galatians 4:10. Really? But it's no surprise since he has admitted on many, many occasions that he breaks the Sabbath regularly. He sees nothing wrong with buying gas and eating out on the Sabbath. Marvin Moore is a man who's on a mission to destroy historic Adventism. Anything I've read from him, he makes a point to try and stamp and destroy anybody that's teaching standards or obedience. As a matter of fact, this whole book, Gospel versus Legalism, it was written just for that sole purpose. Now, I'm not making this up. The beginning of the book, he talks about, oh, I'm sorry, I have to talk about dirty laundry, which is a farce. He's always doing this. But he talks about the poor legalists in the church, meaning those that teach you have to actually obey, that there are standards a church should have. Um, by the way, for those of you that think there shouldn't be standards, I say, what's wrong with standards? McDonald's even has standards that you abide by to work there. You know, the Amish have standards. Why is it that the Seventh day Adventist church, who has been given counsel by God, so I would consider this, I mean, standards, more than standards here, people. We've been given this counsel by God, and we want to say, oh, don't talk about that. Well, why not? Why can't we take a stand on it? Did God give this to us or not? If you don't believe God gave it to us, if you don't believe Ellen White was truly a prophet, then why are you a Seventh day Adventist? Do you know there's many pastors that really question that today? But I don't want to get too off track and rambly here. The fact is, this book was written against people teaching the truth. He starts it by talking about poor legalists, and he ends this book by teaching poor church members how not to listen to anyone that wants to come to them and teach them the truth. Yes, he spends a chapter telling you what to say to people that would dare come up and say, look, you know that Ellen White said, or you know, we should. He tells you, don't listen to them. Just say no, thank you, and go on your way. Marvin Moore is on a mission to destroy the truth. Now, I'm sorry for those of you that has always believed in him or followed him, uh, but you really need to question some of the statements. I mean, do you accept those two statements? These three, actually, about obedience. And what about that one that contradicts what Ellen White said? What about these? Do you really believe that way? Then I question uh, your understanding of Adventism. Then, if you believe the way he does. But see, Marvin Moore's problem is the same problem Satan had. See, when Satan was Lucifer, didn't he make the argument, we don't need laws, we're above that, you see, we're holy beings. Well, in this book, Marvin Moore has basically stated the same thing. We're above laws now because we're under Calvary. And he reaffirms that thought on page, it was page 143, 144, when he stated this. Legalists find the idea of making up their own minds about what is right and wrong quite threatening. This is particularly true when common sense would suggest a course of action contrary to what Scripture seems to say. Now, do you believe that? So, so now we're just supposed to make up our own minds about what's right and wrong? I'm sorry, but Marvin Moore has the hellish torch of Satan in his hands, as Ellen White said, that many pastors would have in the last days. His theology is so crazy, you have to ask yourself, how is it he is still the editor of Signs of the Times? Just think about that for a while. But now, at the beginning of the video, I said this is much more than about Marvin Moore. And what you need to understand is that while he will state it plainly and bluntly and clearly, other new theology guys believe exactly this way. But they will not state it as clearly because they realize they could lose their job. Although they shouldn't fear about that because apparently you won't lose your job no matter how crazy you can get today. I don't understand how he can still retain his position as editor of Signs of the Times. I don't understand why people invite him to churches or camp meetings where he teaches you can't obey, you don't obey. It's not about obedience. And people have even stood up and said, how can you teach this stuff here? And he will get mad and shout them down. The only reason a man like that can continue is because many in the church believe the same way. That's why I started with this first quote about obedience is not a condition of salvation. I realized that many of you would say, well, yeah, it's not a condition to salvation. It's we'll obey, but it's not a condition. You see what the new theology has done to your own thinking. That statement in 1899 is not the only time she stated that. She stated it earlier, she stated it later. In the 1888 writing, she stated it many times, which proves those men that want to say to talk about 1888 as somehow taught this cheap grace new theology they're teaching is baloney, because she even wrote letter to A.T. Jones, I believe it was, and it's in the books. I think it's in the book Faith and Works, if I recall correctly. Where she said conditions, there are plenty of conditions, and she lists them out. So she made this clear many times that there are conditions to salvation. Obedience is the condition of salvation. So just think, how did you feel at first with that first Marvin Moore statement? Were you willing to stand up and say, absolutely, obedience is a condition of salvation, or did you have some questions about that? And that shows you how far widespread the new theology has gotten in the church. It is everywhere, people. It has taken over the church. Now, if you're still confused about the issue of obedience and salvation and why we can make the statement that obedience is a condition to salvation, then you need to watch my video called Is Obedience a Condition to Salvation? I'll show you why that is so. Well, this is actually a somewhat short video. I left, well, even though it's 22 minutes, it really is about half what I originally had. I left a lot out. I left a lot out. I decided I just wanted to use the 3 or 4 quotes to show you where this man's really coming from. He doesn't believe in the law of God. He doesn't believe in it. But worse is he doesn't love God and yet people follow him. What? Wait, I hear some of you saying, how can I judge like that? It's real simple. It's all about love. Okay? Doesn't the Bible clearly say, if you love me, keep my commandments? Doesn't it clearly state, hereby we do know that we know him if we keep his commandments? And didn't Christ often say, keep the commandments if you love him? The problem is society today is we are pretty selfish. We have a selfish form of love. Look at marriages today. Most marriages in this country end in divorce, and I would guess that the majority of those that don't end in divorce wish they were. It's just a sad state of uh, our our relationship today. It's because we're selfish. We don't love. Let's compare this to marriage. You know, the old joke, the guy throws his socks on the floor and the wife gets tired of picking them up. She says, come on, can't you just throw them in the laundry basket? It's only 10 feet away. He said, well, what's the big deal? It's just some socks. Well, exactly. What is the big deal? It's just the little thing that your wife wants. Do you not love her enough just to say, oh, well, I can just take 2 steps and throw them in the basket? It was just a little thing that Adam and Eve did, wasn't it? It's the little things that show whether we love or not. And most people really don't love their Spouse. They know the things that irritates their spouse because their spouse has told them, and they still don't do them. Why? Oh, I know. You're a sanguine malcontent, blah blah blah. Whatever they convinced you at your weekly Wednesday meeting in church there, so that you can't do certain things because that's just not your personality. The Bible called it sin. If you love somebody, don't you do things for that person? And not the things you choose. You don't you don't buy the gift that you want and give it to, well, some people do, of course. They buy a thing they really like and give it to the other person. But see, it's a selfish love. Do you, have you ever experienced true love? The kind of love that you would die for the person in a heartbeat. You just would do it. I hope everybody has experienced that at least with somebody, whether it's a spouse or a child or a parent or a friend, somebody. See, this kind of love is the kind that says, not only says, oh, they don't like that, they told me don't, how I'm going to change, even though I don't understand it, or to me it seems a little silly. I want to please them. Really, that's really not that strong a love, even at that point. I mean, if the person's had to nag you for years, just finally get you to do something, I'd still challenge. Maybe you need to look at whether you really have given them your heart. Really, we should be out there saying, "What can I do to please them?" Without that person telling you, "What can I do to make them happy?" Well, we treat God the same way. We say, "Lord, I'll give you my heart. Well, I'll give you this part of it. I will follow the health plan, Lord." For me, that's very easy because diet was never a big, food was never a big deal for me. So that's easy. But I could have 10 other things. And he said, "Well, look, I'm obeying you, God. I'm obeying you with this one thing in my life. Don't talk about these other 10 things." I'm afraid that's how the majority of Christians do with with God. But what does the Bible say? If you break the law in one point, you've broken, that's right, break the whole thing. It's either all or nothing. We either give our all to God or we have given nothing. We need to question whether we truly do love God. And these men running around talking about relationship, 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 saying you don't have to obey, proves they do not love God, because you would not be saying that. You would be saying, oh, if you love God, you will obey. If you love God, of course you're going to obey. If you love God, of course obedience is a condition to salvation because you'll be obeying. So if you're not obeying, that shows you don't love God. And so therefore it's a condition because you understand it shows where your heart really is. It's as simple as that, people, and we've made it very hard. The darkness has come into the church, and we're such weak and ignorant human beings. I mean, look at the apostles. It was right in their face and they still didn't get it. Well, the same with us today. Why do we think we're any better? Why do we think we're any better? We're human beings and Satan blinds our eyes. But it's just that simple. If you really love God, if He really has your heart, you will obey. Therefore, obedience is a condition to salvation. Not that you just work on obeying to be saved. That's where there are legalists and they fall on the other side of the ditch. But because you love God and you will do things to please Him, and you'll do things because you say, look, I trust in God. I believe this will be better for me. It sure is painful right now. It sure is hard to stop right now. It sure doesn't feel good right now. Boy, I just don't see how this can work out right now. If you're a true Christian, you've probably gone through that at least once. You're really like, man, I just don't think I can do it. But at some point, you have to get the trust, the belief, the love, the faith. I don't know why it says faith. Faith has to get to the point where it controls the impulses and affection of the heart, or else you don't have faith to be saved. And it does have to reach that point. You have to get to the point where you say, yeah, Lord, you're asking me to climb this mountain, sacrifice my son. And this seems ridiculous, Lord. It just, what you're asking doesn't make any sense. Let me tell you a million reasons why it's not fair. It's not fair, Lord, what you're asking either. But I've done it my way for all these years, and boy, I don't understand it, but I'm going to do it. And I believe something's going to work out somehow. And we have to at least get to that point. So where is your heart really? This is what we should be asking ourselves every day. Every morning, we should be saying, Lord, take our hearts. Please, Lord, I don't understand things. I'm not going to see things right in the right way. I'm going to make mistakes, but help me not choose to sin. Help me to trust in you, to do your will because I love you. Ultimately, people in heaven are going to be there because they love God. And the people outside of heaven are going to be there because they really did not love God. I don't care what position they had, what they said, or what they wrote, or what they talked about. Obedience is such a clear uh, indication of the heart. It really, really is. God knew what he was doing here, folks. So you see, you can have the Bible memorized. You can be a great evangelist. You can be a great historic evangelist preaching the truth, man. Just it sounds great. It sounds good. It's wonderful stuff. You can be like A.T. Jones comes out with this truth that they lost sight of. And yet Ellen White said, you know what she wrote to A.T. Jones? She said, "You have a hold of the truth, brother, but the truth doesn't have a hold of you." So we can have all this and knowledge and truth and everything, but obedience will show whether or not God has a hold of us. So does God have a hold of you? If not, your efforts maybe need to be there, letting God take control of you.